April 6, 1945. Radar Picket Station Number One, 50 miles north of Okinawa. The destroyer USS Bush rides the swells in cold morning light, her 5-inch guns tracking empty sky. Lieutenant Commander Rollin Westholm stands in the Combat Information Center, watching green phosphor traces sweep across the scope. At 0600 hours, the blips appear. Not one, not 10, dozens, then more, multiplying like cells dividing under a microscope. By noon, the count exceeds 300 aircraft inbound from Kyushu. The Kikusui attacks have begun. Operation Floating Chrysanthemum. The Japanese High Command is throwing everything that can fly at the American fleet anchored off Okinawa. Most of these pilots have been airborne for less than 20 hours total in their abbreviated training. They know how to take off, navigate by compass, and dive. That is all they need to know. Bush opens fire at 13,000 yards. Her Mark 37 director locks onto a target. The computers calculate lead, altitude, and velocity. The 5-inch batteries roar. Shell after shell arcs into the pale blue morning. Many of these projectiles carry something the Japanese pilots cannot see, cannot predict, and will never understand until the moment it tears their aircraft apart. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In the nose of each shell, smaller than a wine bottle, sits a complete radio transmitter and receiver. 4 vacuum tubes hardened to survive 20,000 times the force of gravity. A tiny antenna, a battery, all of it engineered to do one thing: detonate when metal passes within lethal range. The proximity fuse, the VT fuse, variable time they called it, to obscure its true nature. By April of 1945, it had become the most closely guarded conventional weapon in the American arsenal. And on this morning, off Okinawa, it would face its ultimate test: 355 kamikaze aircraft, 19 hours of continuous assault. The question was not whether the fuse would work. The question was whether it could work fast enough, reliably enough, in sufficient volume, to prevent the systematic destruction of the invasion fleet. The Japanese did not expect the sky itself to become weaponized against them. They expected flak, the familiar black bursts of timed explosives, the wall of lead from 40mm and 20mm batteries. What they encountered instead was precision, shells that detonated not where gunners predicted, but where aircraft actually flew. Air bursts that appeared as if guided by some malevolent intelligence, bracketing their approach, shredding wings and engines with fragment patterns calculated for maximum lethality. The kamikazes pressed forward anyway. Courage and determination could overcome many obstacles. Physics was not one of them. The story of how American shells learned to sense their targets begins not in the Pacific Theater, but in a requisitioned Chevrolet garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, in the spring of 1942. The National Defense Research Committee had assembled a team under the direction of Merle Tuvey, a brilliant and temperamental physicist from the Carnegie Institution. Their mandate was straightforward and seemingly impossible: create a fuse that could detect aircraft and detonate automatically, make it small enough to fit in an artillery shell, make it rugged enough to survive being fired from a gun, make it cheap enough to manufacture by the millions. Every major power had explored the concept. Germany had developed over 30 different proximity fuse designs by 1939, acoustic sensors that would trigger on engine noise, electrostatic detectors that would respond to charged aircraft surfaces, radio-based systems using capacitive effects. None had reached production. The technical obstacles were too severe. The miniaturization required exceeded what vacuum tube technology of the era could deliver. The acceleration forces, when a shell was fired, 20,000 times normal gravity, pulverized any electronics delicate enough to function as a radio. The spin imparted by rifled gun barrels, 25,000 revolutions per minute, created centrifugal forces that tore components apart. By 1940, German engineers had concluded that a practical proximity fuse was impossible. Hitler's directives prioritized only those projects that could reach production within 6 months to support the invasion of the Soviet Union. The proximity fuse programs were abandoned. Britain had reached further. Researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had conceived of using miniature Doppler radar systems. They built prototypes that worked 50% of the time under ideal conditions. For military use, this was inadequate. More fundamentally, Britain lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce even a marginally functional design. The cost was astronomical. The supply of miniature vacuum tubes, the smallest available being those used in hearing aids, could not meet the demand. The acceleration problem remained unsolved. When America entered the war, British scientists shared their research through the Tizard mission. But it would be American scientists and American industry that actually made it work, not as a laboratory curiosity, as a weapon that could be produced in the millions. The team at what became the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, formally established on March 10, 1942, settled on a radio-based design using Doppler principles. A miniature transmitter in the nose of the shell would emit radio waves at approximately 180 to 220 MHz. When these waves struck a target and reflected back, the frequency would shift due to the Doppler effect, the same principle that makes a train whistle change pitch as it passes. When the reflected signal reached a predetermined frequency, indicating the target was within lethal range, typically 20 to 30 feet, an electrical circuit would close and fire the detonator. The theory was elegant. Making it work required solving problems that seemed to violate the laws of engineering. Consider what a 5-inch shell experiences. When fired, it accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in roughly 20 feet of gun barrel. Every component inside endures a crushing force equivalent to being struck by a sledgehammer traveling at terminal velocity. The shell then spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it passes through the rifled barrel. And after surviving this violence, the delicate electronics had to function perfectly during the few seconds of flight time before reaching the target. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined the laboratory in April of 1942, faced the task of developing what the team called rugged vacuum tubes. He started with miniature tubes that Raytheon and Sylvania had developed for hearing aids. These were designed to sit gently in someone's pocket. Van Allen needed tubes that could survive artillery fire. Working with Sylvania engineers, he redesigned the tubes from first principles. The glass envelopes were thickened and carefully annealed to prevent shattering. The internal filaments, normally suspended on delicate wire supports, were mounted on rigid ceramic pillars. The tube elements themselves were embedded in a shock-absorbing compound. Every connection point was reinforced. Every possible failure mode was engineered out. Testing was brutal. Tubes were placed in special test fixtures and subjected to 20,000 times normal gravity, then spun at 25,000 revolutions per minute, then exposed to temperature extremes from -40 degrees Fahrenheit to +160 degrees. Then stored for months and tested again. The early failure rate was catastrophic. 90% of prototypes did not survive firing. The team refined the design, changed materials, adjusted manufacturing processes. By January of 1942, they achieved 52% reliability. The Navy accepted this rate, 52%. One shell in two might not work. But one shell in two that worked was revolutionary compared to the alternative. The alternative was timed fuses. A gunner would observe an incoming aircraft, estimate its range, altitude, speed, and course. A fire control computer, mechanical and analog, would calculate where the aircraft would be in the seconds it took for a shell to reach that altitude. A fuse setter would mechanically adjust the timing mechanism on each shell as it was loaded. The shell would fly its ballistic arc and, if all calculations were perfect, if the aircraft maintained course and speed, if the fuse timing mechanism functioned correctly, the shell would detonate near the target. The chance of success was minimal. Statistics from 1942 showed that it required approximately 2,500 5-inch shells, properly aimed and timed, to destroy one enemy aircraft. The proximity fuse changed that calculation fundamentally. It did not care about prediction. It cared about presence. If an aircraft was near the shell when it passed, the fuse detonated. If the aircraft jinked, or dove, or climbed, the fuse adjusted in real time. It could not miss in the traditional sense. It could only fail to detect, and even with a 50% failure rate, a proximity-fused shell was exponentially more likely to damage or destroy a target than a timed fuse that had to be set perfectly before firing. Production began in November of 1942. The first batch of 5,000 shells went to the Pacific under the care of Captain William Parsons, who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard Enola Gay en route to Hiroshima. Parsons consulted with Admiral Halsey about which ships were most likely to face air attack. The fuses were loaded aboard the cruiser Helena and the Craypice, carriers Enterprise and Saratoga. On January 5, 1943, Helena was operating off Guadalcanal when Japanese aircraft attacked. A dive bomber approached through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Helena's 5-inch batteries opened up with VT-fused ammunition. 9 shells. 1 aircraft destroyed. The fuse had drawn blood. Through 1943, American ships fired 9,128 VT-fused shells in combat, destroying 61 aircraft. This yielded a rate of 155 rounds per kill, compared to 508 rounds per kill for timed fuses during the same period. The improvement was stark. But these were conventional attacks, aircraft that approached, released weapons, and attempted to escape. The pilots wanted to live. That fact shaped their tactics, their approach angles, their willingness to press through defensive fire. Beginning in October of 1944, that calculus changed. The Japanese introduced organized special attack units, Kamikaze, Divine Wind, pilots who did not intend to return. The first mass employment occurred during the invasion of Leyte in the Philippines. Suicide attacks were terrifyingly effective. Between October of 1944 and March of 1945, kamikazes sank 22 vessels and killed more than 2,200 Americans. At Iwo Jima, in February of 1945, 50 kamikazes from the 601 Air Group sank the escort carrier Bismarck C and badly damaged the carrier Saratoga. The psychological impact was profound. Conventional air attacks could be discouraged. Anti-aircraft fire, the sight of other aircraft being destroyed, the prospect of surviving to fly another mission, all created pressure to break off. Kamikazes had no such constraints, as the headquarters of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet stated in April of 1945. The suicide attack represents by far the most difficult anti-aircraft problem yet faced by the fleet. The psychological value of anti-aircraft fire, which in the past has driven away a large percentage of potential attackers, is inoperative against the suicide plane. If the plane is not shot down, or so severely damaged that its control is impaired, it almost inevitably will hit its target. The 20mm and 40mm guns that formed the close-in defense of American ships lacked the destructive power to reliably stop a kamikaze. They could tear pieces off an aircraft, kill the pilot, set the fuel tanks ablaze. But the aircraft would keep coming, carried by momentum and gravity, until it struck or splashed. Only the 5-inch gun, with its larger bursting charge and longer effective range, could deliver the kind of damage that broke a kamikaze's trajectory before it reached terminal dive. And only when coupled with the proximity fuse did the 5-inch gun have a reasonable chance of placing that destructive burst within lethal range of a fast-moving, maneuvering target. By 1945, American industry was producing VT fuses at an extraordinary rate. Multiple manufacturers across the country, over 100 companies involved in some aspect of production. Quality improved, reliability climbed to 70%. The price, initially over $50 per unit, dropped to $18 through mass production efficiencies. Procurement contracts exceeded $450 million in 1945 alone. The fuses were no longer scarce. They were abundant enough to be used without conservation. This abundance shaped doctrine. Ships began loading high percentages of proximity-fused ammunition, 50 to 75% of magazines, with recommendations to use 100% at night or against diving attacks. The typical 5-inch mount on an American destroyer could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute. With proximity fuses, every shell became a potential kill. The only limit was how fast the guns could train, how quickly ammunition could be passed from the magazines, how long the barrels could endure sustained firing without overheating. At Okinawa, those limits would be tested to destruction. The invasion of Okinawa, Operation Iceberg, commenced on April 1, 1945. 1,321 ships gathered in the far western Pacific. Most came from Leyte and Ulithi, others from Pearl Harbor, the Solomons, the Marshalls. The fleet was massive, powerful, and utterly vulnerable to air attack. The island's proximity to the Japanese home islands, less than 400 miles from Kyushu, placed American ships within easy range of every aircraft the Japanese could still fly. Intelligence estimated thousands of aircraft stockpiled in southern Japan, reserved for the defense of Okinawa and the eventual defense of the home islands themselves. The Japanese plan, Operation Tengo, emphasized massed Tokko raids, Kikusui attacks, floating chrysanthemums, 10 major offensives, each involving hundreds of aircraft, most designated for suicide missions. The goal was not to win, the goal was attrition. To sink enough ships, kill enough men, demonstrate enough cost that the Allies would reconsider the demand for unconditional surrender. To force a negotiated peace through sheer willingness to sacrifice, American commanders understood the threat. They established radar picket stations, destroyers and smaller vessels positioned far from the main fleet to provide early warning. These ships, strung in a line to the north and west, would face the kamikaze onslaught first. They were magnets, visible, isolated, easier targets than the carriers and battleships further south. They were also equipped with radar, fighter direction capabilities, and as many guns as could be mounted on their decks. They were the tripwire, the alarm system, and, when necessary, the sacrifice. The first days of April were quiet. Sporadic attacks, a few aircraft, here and there, single planes that penetrated the combat air patrol and struck hard before being destroyed. The transport Alpine was hit on the evening of April 1st, killing 16. The Okinawa was crashed and bombed, losing 5 dead and 41 wounded. Small raids continued. Tensions rose. Where were the thousands of aircraft intelligence had predicted? On April 6th, the weather improved. Wind from the northeast, strong enough to raise whitecaps but not enough to interfere with flight operations. Temperature between 60 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The morning passed quietly. At Radar Picket Station Number One, Bush and her companion destroyers maintained their patrol. At Radar Picket Station Number Two, the destroyer Colhoun scanned empty sky. At Station Number 3, the destroyer Cassin Young, a Boston Navy Yard-built Fletcher-class vessel that had already survived multiple actions in the Marianas and Philippines, held position. The radar operators watched their scopes. Routine sweep. Routine sweep. Then, shortly after noon, the scopes lit up. Multiple contacts, bearing north, range decreasing, altitude mixed, speed approximately 200 knots. Count. Uncertain. More than 50. More than 100. The number kept rising. By 1300 hours, the count exceeded 300 aircraft, some flying in formations, others solo, all inbound, all committed. Kikusui Number One had begun. The largest mass kamikaze attack in history was descending on the American fleet. Every ship that could see the radar returns went to general quarters. Crews raced to battle stations, guns were manned, magazines opened, ammunition passed up in a continuous chain, fire control directors came online, radars locked onto targets, combat air patrols, Hellcats and Corsairs streaked north to intercept. But there were too many targets, far too many. Some would get through. Bush opened fire first among the picket stations. Her 5-inch batteries tracked a formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The Mark 37 director, radar-controlled and coupled to mechanical computers, calculated firing solutions at a rate impossible for human gunners alone. Range, bearing, altitude, target speed, wind. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The ship's own motion, all fed into the analog computers, all translated into gun train and elevation orders. The mount swung smoothly, hydraulics hissing, breech blocks slammed, shells arced into the morning sky. Many carried VT fuses. The first aircraft to reach Bush was a Nakajima B-5N Kate, a torpedo bomber repurposed as a kamikaze. It approached low over the water, hoping to use the sea return clutter on American radar to mask its approach. Bush's gunners spotted it visually at 4,000 yards. The 5-inch batteries opened up. 3 shells. 4. The third round detonated 30 feet from the Kate's port wing. The proximity fuse had sensed metal. It had fired the detonator. The shell exploded, sending thousands of fragments forward and outward in a carefully calculated pattern. Fragments tore through aluminum skin. The Kate's wing folded. The aircraft snap-rolled and hit the water at 200 miles per hour. The first kill of Kikusui Number One, but there were 354 more aircraft inbound. Bush continued firing, shell after shell. The crew worked with practiced efficiency. Loaders, trainers, pointers. Each man a link in a chain of destruction. The magazines fed a steady stream of ammunition, 50% VT fused, 50% conventional, providing visual confirmation that the guns were aimed correctly. The black puffs of timed bursts mixed with the sharper, brighter detonations of proximity fuses, the sky filled with steel. A second aircraft appeared, a Mitsubishi A6M0, the fighter that had dominated the early Pacific War, now relegated to a one-way mission. It dove from 5,000 feet, engines screaming. Bush's forward mount tracked it. 2 shells. The first passed harmlessly ahead. The second, VT fused, detonated 40 feet below the Zero's fuselage. The fragments struck the aircraft's belly and cockpit. The Zero pitched up violently, out of control. It clipped the water 200 yards from Bush's bow. Another kill. Then a third aircraft. And a fourth. And more behind them. The attacks came in waves, coordinated but not precise. Japanese pilots, many with minimal training, following heading and altitude instructions given before takeoff. Some dove immediately, others circled, looking for the largest targets. Some flew straight into the defensive fire, committed to their final mission. Others wavered, hesitated, their courage faltering in the face of the steel hurricane rising to meet them. Bush shot down 4 aircraft in the first 30 minutes of the attack. Each kill represented the intersection of radar technology, mechanical computing, skilled gunnery, and the invisible trigger waiting inside each VT-fused shell. The fuse did not care about the pilot's courage. It did not care about the aircraft's maneuverability. It cared only about proximity. Metal approaching, radio waves reflecting, frequency shifting, circuit closing, detonator firing, burst. At 1400 hours, Bush's luck changed. A Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber, hit by multiple rounds that failed to stop it, crashed into the ship's starboard side amidships. The aircraft's bomb penetrated the deck and exploded in the forward engine room. Steam and smoke erupted. The ship's speed dropped. Power failed. Men screamed. The damage control parties raced to contain fires and flooding. Bush began to settle by the bow. She was still fighting, guns still firing, but she was dying. Another kamikaze, seeing Bush crippled and slowing, selected her as an easy target. It dove from the northeast. Bush's after-guns tracked it. The mount captain, his crew working by manual control with no power to the hydraulic systems, called out bearings and elevations. The loaders kept feeding shells. VT-fused shells. 2 rounds, 3. The fourth shell detonated 20 feet from the Judy's propeller. Fragments shredded the aircraft's nose. The pilot was killed instantly. The aircraft's dive angle steepened and it hit the water 50 yards from Bush's stern. But then a fifth kamikaze appeared. Bush had nothing left. Her forward guns were offline. Her aftermount was out of ammunition. The crew could only watch as the aircraft approached, wings level, steady, committed. It struck Bush near the forward stack. The explosion tore through what remained of the superstructure. Men were thrown overboard. Others were trapped below decks as the ship began to sink faster. The destroyer Colquhoun, seeing Bush's distress, moved to assist. As she approached, 3 kamikazes attacked her simultaneously. Colquhoun's guns fired desperately. One aircraft was destroyed by a proximity-fused burst at 3,000 yards. The second was hit by 40mm fire and splashed short. The third aircraft, a Zero, pressed through the defensive fire and crashed into Colquhoun's deck. The bomb exploded. Fires erupted. Within minutes, Colquhoun was also sinking. Both destroyers, veterans of the Pacific War, decorated for bravery and effectiveness, were now lost. The picket line had held, but at enormous cost. Across the fleet, the pattern repeated. At Radar Picket Station Number 3, Cassin Young faced similar attacks. She shot down 3 aircraft with VT-fused ammunition and assisted Bush before Bush went down. Cassin Young's gunners fired continuously for over an hour. Barrels overheated, cooling systems strained. Men worked through exhaustion. The ship survived, but suffered casualties. 1 man killed, 59 wounded when a kamikaze clipped the mast and exploded overhead, close enough that the proximity fuse in one of Cassin Young's own shells might have detonated it prematurely. The irony was not lost on the survivors. The effectiveness of the VT fuse during Kikusui Number One can be measured statistically. Of the 355 kamikaze aircraft launched, 22 penetrated the layered defenses of radar pickets, combat air patrol, and ship-based anti-aircraft fire to strike their targets. The remaining 333 were destroyed, not all by VT fuses. Combat air patrols accounted for many. Conventional anti-aircraft weapons, the 20mm and 40mm guns, destroyed others at close range. But the 5-inch batteries firing proximity-fused ammunition played a critical role in the outer defense layer, destroying or damaging aircraft before they reached the point where smaller caliber weapons could engage effectively. The Navy's analysis of ammunition expenditure during the Okinawa campaign showed that 5-inch VT-fused shells required an average of 310 rounds per kamikaze destroyed. 5-inch shells with conventional timed fuses required 1,162 rounds per kill. The proximity fuse was nearly 4 times as effective. This multiplier effect was decisive. American ships could not carry unlimited ammunition. Magazine capacity was finite. The ability to destroy aircraft with fewer shells meant more aircraft could be engaged before magazines were depleted. It meant more time before ships had to withdraw to rearm. It meant the difference between survival and sinking. The Japanese pilots, those who survived long enough to approach within visual range of the fleet, reported strange behavior in American anti-aircraft fire. Shells seemed to explode precisely at their altitude, regardless of how they maneuvered. They dove, and shells burst below them. They climbed, and shells burst above. They jinked left or right, and still the explosions bracketed their aircraft. Some pilots, in debriefings after being captured or rescued, described the American fire as intelligent or guided. They could not conceive that a shell, once fired, could sense and react to their presence. The Japanese High Command, reviewing loss rates from Kikusui Number One, knew that something had changed in American anti-aircraft capability. Reports from pilots who aborted missions and returned spoke of unprecedented accuracy, but without recovering an intact proximity fuse for analysis, without understanding the mechanism, Japanese engineers could not develop countermeasures. Electronic jamming might have been possible, but it required knowing the operating frequency. Reducing the radar cross-section of aircraft might have helped, but that required metallurgical and design changes impossible to implement quickly. The only practical defense was to attack at night, when visual identification was harder, or to fly so low over the water that proximity fuses might detonate prematurely against sea return. Both tactics had severe limitations. Night attacks reduced accuracy for the attackers as much as the defenders. Flying low increased fuel consumption and pilot fatigue, and still did not guarantee safety. The VT fuse could distinguish between large metal objects and smaller ones. It could differentiate between an aircraft at 30 feet and wave tops at 10 feet. The discrimination was not perfect, but it was effective enough, and so the kamikazes kept coming, wave after wave, knowing that most would be destroyed before reaching their targets, hoping that a few would get through. Kikusui No. 2 launched on April 11th and continued for 2 days. Over 300 kamikazes. More ships were hit, more men died. The destroyer Hugh W. Hadley, on radar picket duty, was attacked by 26 aircraft over a 90-minute period. She shot down 18, 10 with VT-fused 5-inch ammunition, 8 with close-range automatic weapons. Of the remaining 8 aircraft, 4 were destroyed by combat air patrol. 2 splashed attempting to hit Hadley and missing, and 2 struck the ship. Hadley survived, barely, and was later awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for her defense. The pattern continued through May and June. Kikusui, No. 3 through No. 10. Each attack involved hundreds of aircraft. Each cost the Japanese dearly in pilots and planes they could not replace. Each inflicted casualties and damage on American ships, but not enough to stop the invasion, not enough to force negotiations. The American fleet absorbed the punishment and kept fighting. The VT fuse was not a perfect defense. Ships were still hit, men still died, but the fuse provided a margin of survival that would not have existed otherwise. By the time the Okinawa campaign ended in late June of 1945, nearly 2/3 of all VT fuses expended during the entire war had been used in just 7.5 months, over 14 million fuses fired in combat. Over 200 aircraft confirmed destroyed by proximity-fused ammunition alone, with many more damaged or driven off. The fuse had become the long arm of fleet protection, allowing ships to engage aircraft at ranges where only the 5-inch gun was effective, creating a defensive zone that extended thousands of yards from the fleet. The cost of this defense was paid in other ways. Ships' magazines were depleted at unprecedented rates. Destroyers returned to Keramaretto, the anchorage off Okinawa, to rearm sometimes twice in a single day. The logistics trains supplying VT fuses strained but never broke. Factories in the United States operated continuously. Ships carried fuses across the Pacific in convoys. Ammunition ships transferred fuses at sea. The American industrial capacity that had produced 2 million VT fuses in 1943 produced over 10 million in 1945. Quality improved as production scaled. By war's end, reliability exceeded 80%. The price per unit continued to fall. Mass production efficiency made what had seemed impossible in 1940, not just possible but routine by 1945. The Japanese, for their part, never developed an effective countermeasure. After the war, in interrogations, Japanese engineers and officers admitted they had not believed proximity fuses were practical until they began recovering unexploded American shells from land impacts. Even then, the fuses they recovered were either damaged or had been rendered safe by their self-destruct mechanisms. Japanese attempts to reverse engineer the technology came too late. By the time they understood what they were facing, the war was over. The proximity fuse's impact extended beyond the Pacific theatre. In Europe, VT-fused shells were used to devastating effect against Von-flying bombs targeting London and Antwerp. The combination of radar-guided tracking, automatic gun directors, and proximity fuses created a defensive system that shot down hundreds of V-1s. On a single day in August of 1944, of 104 V-1s launched, 68 were destroyed by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. German engineers, examining unexploded American shells recovered from the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, were shocked by what they found. Miniature radio transmitters, vacuum tubes that had survived artillery fire, technology they had declared impossible. One German report stated, "The enemy has achieved what our finest engineers said could not be done." But it was in the Pacific, against the Kamikazes, that the VT fuse proved most critical. The suicide attacks represented a unique challenge. Conventional deterrence did not work. Anti-aircraft fire that would cause normal pilots to break off or change tactics had no effect on pilots committed to dying. The only solution was destruction. Complete, immediate, final destruction before the aircraft reached its target. The proximity fuse provided that solution more reliably than any alternative. The personal cost was borne by the men on the radar picket stations, destroyers and smaller vessels that stood between Kamikazes and the main fleet. These ships absorbed attack after attack. At Okinawa, 16 radar picket destroyers were sunk or damaged beyond repair. Dozens more sustained damage. Casualties among picket crews were disproportionately high. Men served tours on picket duty, knowing that the chances of being hit were substantial. They served anyway, because the alternative was leaving the transports and carriers undefended. The destroyer USS Laffey, on radar picket duty on April 16th, earned the nickname the ship that would not die, after surviving 6 kamikaze hits and 4 bomb strikes during an 80-minute attack. She shot down 9 aircraft, most with proximity-fused 5-inch ammunition. The crew fought fires, controlled flooding, repaired damage, and kept guns firing throughout the attack. Laffey survived and returned to service. Her crew received a Presidential Unit citation. The VT fuses aboard Laffey had done their job, destroying enough attackers that the ship could survive the few that got through. Similar stories repeated across the fleet. Ships that should have been sunk stayed afloat. Ships that should have lost dozens of men to single attacks suffered casualties but survived. The margin between survival and destruction was often measured in seconds and yards. A kamikaze destroyed at 1,000 yards instead of 200 yards gave damage control parties time to prepare. An aircraft crippled at 2,000 yards but still flying might miss entirely or crash short. Every yard mattered. Every second mattered. The VT fuse bought both. As the Okinawa campaign ground toward its conclusion, American planners looked ahead to Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands scheduled for November of 1945. Intelligence estimates predicted that thousands of aircraft would be held in reserve for this final battle. The kamikaze attacks at Okinawa would be a preview of what the invasion fleet would face. Plans called for unprecedented levels of proximity-fused ammunition. Every ship would carry maximum loads. Resupply would be continuous. The 5-inch guns would fire until barrels wore out, then barrels would be replaced, and firing would continue. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 rendered these plans unnecessary. Japan surrendered. The invasion never occurred. The kamikazes never flew their final missions. But the lessons learned at Okinawa shaped post-war naval air defense, the importance of radar pickets, the need for layered defenses, the value of proximity fuses. These concepts carried forward into the guided missile age, where the principles of the VT fuse, radio waves sensing targets and triggering detonation, evolved into the sophisticated proximity fuses used in surface-to-air missiles today. The men who fought at Okinawa, who stood on radar picket stations and fired 5-inch guns until the barrels glowed red, carried memories of the kamikazes for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of the attacks frequently, others never discussed them, but all remembered the sky filling with aircraft, the desperate minutes of maximum rate fire, the sight of ships burning on the horizon, the knowledge that survival often depended on technology they did not fully understand, but had learned to trust completely. Seaman First Class Thomas Matisak, aboard the destroyer Luce when she was hit by 2 kamikazes on May 4, 1945, and sank in less than 10 minutes, remembered the sharks that attacked survivors in the water. He remembered men screaming. He remembered being pulled aboard a rescue vessel and looking back at where Luce had been. 149 men were lost. Matisak survived because he had been on watch topside when the kamikazes hit. The proximity fuses aboard Luce had destroyed several attackers before the ship was hit. They had bought time for some men to abandon ship. Not enough time for all. Lieutenant Commander Rollin Westholm, captain of Bush, went down with his ship on April 6. He remained in the Combat Information Center, directing defensive fire, even as the ship sank beneath him. His body was never recovered. Of Bush's crew of 330 men, 94 were killed or missing. Colquhoun lost 35 killed. These losses were repeated across the radar picket stations. Men died so that others, further back in the fleet, might survive. The VT fuse gave them a fighting chance. It did not guarantee survival. Nothing could guarantee that. But it tilted the odds in favor of those willing to stand and fight. By late June, when organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa ended, the suicide attacks tapered off. Individual kamikazes still appeared. The destroyer USS Callahan was hit and sunk on July 29 by an obsolete Yokosuka K-5Y biplane, a fabric-covered trainer pressed into kamikaze service. But the mass attacks, the Kikusui operations, were over. The Japanese were conserving what remained of their air forces for the invasion they knew was coming. The final accounting of the Okinawa campaign showed that approximately 1,900 kamikaze attacks occurred. About 14% of kamikazes managed to hit a ship. The remaining 86% were destroyed by some combination of combat air patrol, proximity-fused 5-inch shells, and close-range automatic weapons. The VT fuse was one component of a layered defense that included radar, fighter direction, skilled gunnery, and desperate courage. But it was a critical component. Without it, the casualty rate among American ships would have been catastrophically higher. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal said after the war, "The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet, our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater." Prime Minister Winston Churchill called the fuse potent in defending Britain against Vosne attacks. General George Patton said, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge and would require a complete revision of land warfare tactics." But the most telling assessment came from the men who used it in combat. Gunner's Mate Second Class John Chapman, aboard the destroyer Newcomb when she was hit by 5 kamikazes on April 6, remembered firing his 5-inch gun continuously for over an hour. He remembered seeing aircraft fall from the sky, torn apart by proximity-fused bursts. He remembered the heat of the barrel, the smell of cordite, the mechanical rhythm of loading and firing. He remembered that 4 aircraft were shot down, 5 got through. Newcomb survived, barely. 91 men were killed or wounded. Chapman said later, "People try to glorify wars and so forth. There's people that do outstanding things, but there's nothing really glorious about a war." The proximity fuse was not glorious. It was a tool, a piece of technology that gave men like Chapman a chance to defend their ships and their lives. It worked more often than it failed. It killed more enemies than it missed. In the brutal arithmetic of naval warfare off Okinawa in the spring of 1945, that was enough. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately a story about solving impossible problems through the application of extraordinary resources, brilliant engineering, and relentless determination. Every major power in World War II attempted to develop a practical proximity fuse. Only America succeeded, because only America had the combination of scientific talent, industrial capacity, and willingness to invest massive resources in a single technology. 22 million fuses produced during the war. Over 100 manufacturers involved. Research and development costs in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But the return on that investment was measured in ships saved and lives preserved. The Japanese kamikazes were brave. Their willingness to sacrifice themselves was rooted in cultural beliefs and military indoctrination that are difficult for outsiders to fully comprehend. They flew into defensive fire that would have turned back any rational pilot. They pressed attacks that had no chance of success. They died by the thousands to achieve goals that were, by April of 1945, already unachievable. Japan could not win the war, but they could make the Allies pay for victory. That was the calculation. Attrition. Cost. The hope that enough pain might lead to negotiation. The proximity fuse helped ensure that this calculation failed. It did not win the war alone. No single weapon or technology ever does. But it contributed to the overwhelming superiority in defensive capability that allowed the American fleet to absorb the kamikaze onslaught and continue operations. It represented what America did better than any other nation during World War II. The ability to identify a critical need, allocate resources to meet that need, solve engineering problems that seemed insurmountable, and mass-produce the solution quickly enough to affect the war's outcome. The VT fuse was not a wonder weapon. It was a very good weapon produced in very large numbers. That distinction mattered. Germany invested in advanced technologies that arrived too late or in insufficient quantities. The jet fighters, the ballistic missiles, the snorkel submarines, all impressive, all ineffective at changing the war's outcome. America invested in technologies designed for mass production: radar, proximity fuses, Liberty ships, Sherman tanks. None were perfect. All were effective. All could be produced faster than the enemy could destroy them. That approach, more than any single battlefield victory, decided the war. The men who served on radar picket stations off Okinawa in the spring of 1945 did not know about American industrial capacity or strategic planning. They knew that kamikazes were coming. They knew their job was to shoot them down. They knew the 5-inch guns with the special fuses worked better than anything else in their arsenal. That was enough. The rest, the engineering, the physics, the industrial miracle that put 22 million miniature radios into artillery shells, was beyond their concern. Their concern was survival. The proximity fuse helped them survive. For many, it was enough. For some, it was not. The kamikaze attacks ended with Japan's surrender in August of 1945. The proximity fuse remained in service, evolving and improving through the Cold War and beyond. The basic principle, radio waves sensing targets and triggering detonation at optimal range, remains the foundation of proximity fuses used today in everything from anti-aircraft missiles to artillery shells to naval gun systems. The miniature radios of 1945 became transistorized circuits in the 1960s, then integrated circuits, then microprocessors. The technology advanced. The principle remained the same. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.